He looked like a man who had already buried his dreams with his wife. But when Gideon Pratt offered him 3 goats for his daughter's hand in marriage, Malachi Brooks realized some choices could bury you alive. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across Malachi's weathered ranch as he knelt beside his daughter's bed, watching Ruby's small chest struggle with each breath. The fever had taken hold 3 days ago, and without proper medicine, he knew what came next. He'd seen it before with Sarah, his wife, 2 winters past. "Papa," Ruby's voice barely rose above a whisper, her 8-year-old eyes clouded with sickness. Malachi forced a smile, though his heart felt like lead in his chest. "Rest now, little one. Papa's got to tend to some business." The knock on his cabin door came like thunder in the morning silence. Malachi rose slowly, his joints protesting from too many nights sleeping on the hard floor beside Ruby's bed. Through the cracked window he saw Gideon Pratt standing on his porch, hat in hand, with a young woman beside him. Gideon Pratt was known throughout the territory as a man who drove hard bargains and never lost money on a deal. His weathered face showed no emotion as Malachi opened the door, but his eyes moved quickly over the broken porch boards and peeling paint. "Brooks," Gideon nodded curtly. "This here's my daughter, Clementine. I got a proposition that might solve both our problems." Malachi's gaze shifted to the woman. Clementine Shaw stood silent beside her father, wearing a faded brown dress that had seen better years. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, and her green eyes held secrets that made him uneasy. She looked nothing like the pampered daughters of wealthy men he'd expected. "I ain't looking for charity, Pratt," Malachi said, his pride fighting against his desperation. "Ain't offering charity," Gideon replied. "Offering trade. 3 healthy goats for your agreement to marry my daughter. Today." The words hit Malachi like a physical blow. He thought of Ruby's labored breathing, of the empty shelves in his kitchen, of the debts mounting like storm clouds. 3 goats meant milk for Ruby, meat for the winter, maybe enough to trade for the medicine she needed. "Why?" Malachi's voice came out rougher than intended. "Why my daughter when you could find her a proper husband with land and money?" Gideon's smile never reached his eyes. "Let's just say Clementine needs a husband who understands hardship, and you need what I'm offering." Malachi looked at Clementine again, searching her face for answers. She met his gaze steadily, and for just a moment, he saw something flicker there. Fear? Warning? Before he could decide, she looked away. The sound of Ruby's coughing from inside the cabin made his decision for him. "When?" he asked. "Now," Gideon said. "Pastor Williams is waiting at the church. The goats are already in your corral." But as Malachi nodded his agreement, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just signed away more than his freedom. The wedding ceremony lasted exactly 7 minutes. Pastor Williams spoke the words with mechanical precision, his eyes avoiding Malachi's face, as if he knew this union carried shadows that had no place in a house of worship. Clementine's voice barely rose above a whisper when she spoke her vows, but Malachi noticed her hands trembling as she placed them in his. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon Pratt slapped 3 silver coins on the church pew and walked out without another word. The sound of his boots echoed in the empty chapel long after the door slammed shut. Malachi stood there beside his new wife, wondering what kind of man sold his daughter for livestock and disappeared like smoke. But the thought of Ruby waiting at home pushed his questions aside. He needed to get back to her, needed to start milking those goats and preparing the medicine she desperately required. "I'll walk you home," he said to Clementine, his voice formal and distant. She nodded but didn't speak. They walked the dusty path to his cabin in complete silence, the weight of their arrangement settling between them like a wall neither knew how to cross. Malachi kept stealing glances at her profile, trying to understand what kind of woman agreed to marry a stranger for 3 goats. When they reached the cabin, Ruby was awake, her fever-bright eyes watching from the bed as Clementine entered. Malachi saw his daughter's fear and confusion, and his heart clenched with guilt. "How did you explain to an 8-year-old that you'd traded your freedom to keep her alive?" "Ruby, this is Clementine," he said gently. "She's going to be staying with us now." Clementine moved toward the bed with surprising grace, kneeling beside Ruby without hesitation. She placed a cool hand on the child's forehead, and Malachi watched something shift in her expression. The guarded distance disappeared, replaced by genuine concern. "You're burning up, sweet girl," Clementine murmured, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during the ceremony. "When did this fever start?" 3 days ago, Malachi answered. "I've been giving her willow bark tea, but it ain't helping much." Clementine's hands moved expertly over Ruby, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing. Malachi found himself staring. This wasn't the behavior of a simple rancher's daughter. These were the movements of someone who knew medicine, who understood sickness in ways that spoke of experience and training. "She needs more than willow bark," Clementine said, standing and turning to face him. "She needs real medicine, and she needs it tonight." "I know," Malachi replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "But the nearest doctor is 3 days' ride, and I can't afford his prices anyway." Clementine studied his face for a long moment, and he saw her making some kind of decision. Her green eyes hardened with resolve, and she moved toward the door. "I'll be in the barn," she said quietly. "Don't follow me until I call for you." But as she reached for the door handle, she turned back with an expression that made his blood run cold. Malachi watched through the window as Clementine disappeared into the barn, her silhouette swallowed by the growing darkness. The way she'd looked at him before leaving sent ice through his veins. It wasn't the look of a simple rancher's daughter who'd just married a stranger. It was the look of someone carrying dangerous secrets. Ruby's breathing grew more labored as the evening wore on. Malachi sat beside her bed, holding her small hand and listening to the strange sounds coming from the barn. Metal clanging against metal, the scrape of wood being moved, and something else he couldn't identify. What was she doing out there? "Papa," Ruby whispered, her voice weaker than before. "The lady knows about sick people." "Doesn't she?" Malachi squeezed his daughter's hand gently. "What makes you say that, little one?" "Her hands," Ruby replied, her eyes fluttering closed. "They felt like Dr. Morrison's hands. Gentle but knowing." The observation hit Malachi like a revelation. Dr. Morrison had been the only trained physician in their territory before he'd moved east 2 years ago. Ruby was right about the way Clementine had examined her. There was knowledge in those movements, skill that couldn't be learned from birthing calves or tending ranch injuries. A loud crash from the barn made him jump to his feet. Clementine had been out there for over an hour, and the sounds were getting stranger by the minute. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the door, but Ruby's weak cough stopped him. He couldn't leave her alone, not when her breathing was this shallow. 20 minutes later, the barn fell silent. Malachi waited, his heart pounding in the darkness, but no call came. The silence stretched until he could bear it no longer. He wrapped Ruby in an extra blanket and stepped outside. The barn door stood slightly ajar, and a strange, sweet smell drifted from within. Not the usual scent of hay and livestock, but something medicinal, almost like the herbs Dr. Morrison used to grind in his office. Malachi pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. What he saw made no sense. The corner of the barn had been transformed into something resembling a medicine workshop. Glass bottles he'd never seen before lined a makeshift table, filled with liquids of various colors. Dried plants hung from the rafters, and a small fire burned in a metal basin, heating what looked like a ceramic pot. Clementine stood with her back to him, grinding something with a mortar and pestle. She'd removed her wedding dress and wore a simple work shirt and pants that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Her hair was braided back efficiently, and her movements were precise and confident. "I told you not to follow me until I called," she said without turning around. Malachi's mouth went dry. Where did all this come from? These bottles, these herbs. They weren't in my barn this morning. Clementine finally turned to face him, and in the firelight he saw her true face for the first time. The submissive rancher's daughter was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes held knowledge that could either save his daughter or destroy them all. Clementine set down the mortar and pestle, her green eyes reflecting the firelight as she studied Malachi's shocked expression. The medicinal equipment surrounding her told a story that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his new wife. "My father told you I was just a rancher's daughter," she said quietly, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "But men like Gideon Pratt rarely tell the complete truth when there's money involved." Malachi stepped closer, his eyes taking in the organized chaos around him. The glass bottles contained tinctures and extracts he'd only seen in real medical offices. The herbs hanging from the rafters were arranged with the precision of someone who understood their properties intimately. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Clementine Shaw, but I haven't been a rancher's daughter for 7 years," she replied, turning back to her work. "I was trained as a physician's assistant in Denver before the Territorial Medical Board decided women had no place in medicine." The revelation hit Malachi like cold water. A woman with medical training explained the confident way she'd examined Ruby, the knowledge in her touch, the certainty in her voice when she diagnosed what his daughter needed. "Then why are you here?" he pressed. "Why did your father sell you for 3 goats if you have skills that could earn real money?" Clementine's hands stilled over the mixture she was preparing. "Because I made a mistake that cost me everything. A patient died under my care, and the doctor I worked for blamed me to save his own reputation. Word spread quickly that I was dangerous, incompetent. No one would hire me, and my father lost his standing in Denver because of the scandal." She lifted a small bottle filled with dark liquid, holding it up to the light to check its consistency. "He brought me out here hoping the distance would let people forget. But when no suitable husband appeared, and his debts started mounting, he decided 3 goats was better than supporting a daughter no one wanted." Malachi watched her work, seeing the careful precision in every movement. "But you can still practice medicine. You can still help people." "Not legally," she replied, "and not without risking the safety of anyone who trusts me. If word gets out that I'm treating patients without proper authorization, it could mean jail for both of us." The weight of her confession settled over him like a heavy blanket. His new wife wasn't just a woman with medical knowledge. She was a fugitive from her former life, carrying skills that could save Ruby, but at a cost that might destroy them all. "The medicine you're making," he said slowly, "will it help Ruby?" Clementine turned to face him fully, and he saw both determination and fear warring in her expression. "It will save her life. But once I give this to her, there's no going back. You'll know what I'm capable of, and you'll have to decide whether you can live with the risk of harboring someone like me." From the cabin came the sound of Ruby's weak coughing, and Malachi felt time running out like sand through his fingers. But as he looked at the woman who could save his daughter, he realized the hardest choice was still ahead of him. Malachi stared at the small bottle in Clementine's hands, knowing that his next words would determine not just Ruby's fate, but the course of their lives together. The sound of his daughter's labored breathing carried from the cabin, each rasp a reminder that time was slipping away faster than he could think. "What happened to the patient who died?" he asked, needing to understand the full weight of what he was accepting. Clementine's face darkened with pain. "A miner's wife in labor. The baby was positioned wrong, and I tried a procedure I'd seen the doctor perform once, but my hands weren't steady enough. My experience wasn't deep enough. I lost them both." The honesty in her voice cut through his doubts. This wasn't a woman making excuses or hiding from responsibility. This was someone who carried the weight of failure and was terrified of repeating it. "How is Ruby's case different?" Malachi pressed. "Kai. Fever and lung congestion I can treat," Clementine replied, her voice growing stronger. "I've done it dozens of times successfully. This medicine will break her fever and clear her breathing within hours. But if someone recognizes the treatment, if they ask questions about where you got it..." A sudden crash from outside the barn made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the low murmur of male voices. Clementine quickly began shoving her supplies into a large burlap sack, her movements urgent and practiced. "Who is that?" Malachi whispered, moving toward the barn door. "I don't know," Clementine hissed, "but we can't let them see any of this." Through a crack in the barn wall, Malachi saw 3 men dismounting near his cabin. He recognized 2 of them as ranch hands from the Morrison spread, but the third was a stranger wearing the kind of clothes that suggested he had money and authority. "Brooks," one of the ranch hands called out. "We know you're here. Come out and bring that wife of yours." Malachi's blood turned to ice. These men weren't here for a social visit. The way they'd positioned themselves around his cabin, the aggressive tone in their voices, and the fact that they'd specifically mentioned Clementine meant trouble he hadn't anticipated. "They found me," Clementine whispered, her face pale with terror. "Someone must have recognized me at the wedding and sent word." "Who's the third man?" Malachi asked, though he already suspected the answer would change everything. "Territorial marshal, most likely," she replied, finishing her hasty packing. "If he has an arrest warrant, this medicine won't matter. Ruby will die while I'm sitting in jail, and you'll be charged with harboring a fugitive." From the cabin came a weak cry that sounded barely human. Ruby was calling for him, her voice so thin and desperate that it cut through his chest like a blade. He had seconds to choose between his daughter's life and his family's freedom. But as the marshal's voice boomed across his property, demanding their immediate surrender, Malachi realized the choice had already been made for him. Malachi grabbed the bottle of medicine from Clementine's hands and shoved it into his jacket pocket. "Stay here and keep quiet," he whispered urgently. "No matter what happens, don't come out until I call for you." He stepped out of the barn with his hands visible, trying to project calm authority despite the fear clawing at his chest. The three men spread out in a semicircle around him, their positioning clearly practiced and threatening. The marshal was exactly what Malachi had expected. Tall, weathered, with eyes that had seen too much and judged too quickly. His badge caught the moonlight as he stepped forward, a folded paper in his left hand. "Malachi Brooks," the marshal said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "I'm Marshal Hendricks. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Clementine Shaw, wanted for practicing medicine without proper licensing and contributing to the death of 2 patients in Denver territory." Malachi's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. "Don't know anyone by that name. Marshal, just married a woman named Clementine today, but her name's Brooks now." "Don't play games with me, Brooks," Hendricks replied. "We know Gideon Pratt brought his daughter here and arranged a marriage. We also know she's been treating patients illegally across 3 territories, leaving a trail of complaints and dead bodies." The accusation hit Malachi like a physical blow. Clementine had mentioned one patient, one tragic mistake, but multiple deaths across territories suggested something far more dangerous than a single accident. "Even if that were true," Malachi said carefully, "she's my wife now, legally married before God and witnesses. That gives her certain protections under territorial law." Marshal Hendricks smiled coldly. "Marriage to a fugitive makes you an accessory after the fact, Brooks, especially when that fugitive continues practicing without authorization." He gestured toward the barn. "We know she's got medical supplies in there. We know she's been treating patients since she arrived." From inside the cabin came a sound that made Malachi's blood freeze. Ruby was having trouble breathing, her wheezing audible even through the walls. The marshal's eyes sharpened at the sound. "That your daughter in there, Brooks?" Hendricks asked. "Sounds like she's in bad shape. Real bad shape." Malachi said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The marshal nodded slowly, understanding flooding his expression. "I see how it is," Hendricks continued. "Your daughter's sick, and you're desperate enough to trust a woman who's killed patients before. But here's the thing about desperation, Brooks. It makes men do stupid things that get people hurt." One of the ranch hands stepped closer, his hand resting on his gun. "Marshal says the word. We tear this place apart until we find her." But as Ruby's breathing grew more labored from inside the cabin, Malachi realized that surrendering Clementine meant watching his daughter die in his arms. Malachi pulled the medicine bottle from his pocket and held it up where the marshal could see it clearly. "You want to know the truth, Hendricks? My daughter is dying, and this woman made medicine that could save her life. So before you arrest anyone, you better ask yourself if you're prepared to explain to the territory why you let an 8-year-old girl die to settle a score." Marshal Hendricks stared at the bottle, his expression unreadable. "That proves my point, Brooks. She's practicing medicine illegally, putting your daughter at risk with treatments that could kill her." "The fever will kill her if I do nothing," Malachi shot back. "At least this gives her a chance." From the cabin came a sound that made all 4 men freeze. Ruby's breathing had stopped entirely. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before a weak, gasping breath broke through the night air. "She doesn't have much time," Malachi said, his voice cracking with desperation. "Whatever you're going to do, decide now." Marshal Hendricks studied him for a long moment, then spoke in a voice lower than before. "You know what's interesting about those charges against your wife, Brooks? Every single complaint came from the same source. Dr. Hamilton in Denver. Seems he had a habit of blaming his mistakes on his female assistant." The revelation hit Malachi like lightning. What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been tracking the real story across 3 territories," Hendricks continued. "Dr. Hamilton was taking credit for successful treatments and blaming failures on the woman who actually knew what she was doing. When she tried to expose him, he made sure she'd never practice medicine again." One of the ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. "Marshal, if that's true, why are we here arresting her?" Hendricks turned to face the barn where Clementine was hiding. "Because Dr. Hamilton has connections in the territorial government, and innocent women don't have the luxury of due process when powerful men want them silenced." His voice carried a bitterness that suggested personal experience with injustice. Malachi felt the world shifting beneath his feet. "Then why the warrant? Why come here with armed men?" "Because I needed to see for myself," Hendricks replied. "Needed to know if she was really dangerous or just dangerous to the wrong people." He gestured toward the cabin. "The way you're willing to risk everything for your daughter tells me what kind of man you are. And the fact that she's hiding instead of running tells me what kind of woman she is." Another gasping breath from Ruby broke the tension, weaker than the last. Malachi looked at the bottle in his hands, then at the marshal who held his family's fate in his power. "What happens now?" Malachi asked. Marshal Hendricks reached into his jacket and pulled out the warrant, holding it up in the moonlight. Then deliberately and slowly, he tore it in half. But as the pieces of paper fluttered to the ground, the sound of approaching horses thundered through the night air, and Malachi realized their troubles were far from over. 4 riders emerged from the darkness, their expensive clothes and polished weapons marking them as men with serious money and serious intentions. The leader dismounted with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "Marshal Hendricks," the man called out, his voice carrying an Eastern accent that didn't belong in this rough territory. "I'm Agent Morrison, representing Dr. Hamilton's interests. We're here to collect the fugitive and ensure she faces proper justice." Hendricks stepped between Morrison and the cabin, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Funny thing about justice, Morrison. I just finished my investigation and it turns out your boss has been falsifying medical records and blaming his mistakes on innocent people." Morrison's face darkened. "That warrant is legitimate, Marshal. You don't have authority to ignore territorial law." "I have authority to determine whether charges have merit," Hendricks replied. "And these don't." While the men argued, Malachi made his choice. He uncorked the bottle and ran toward the cabin, ignoring the shouts behind him. Ruby lay motionless on her bed, her breathing so shallow he had to lean close to hear it. "Ruby, sweetheart, drink this," he whispered, lifting her head gently. The medicine went down slowly, but Ruby managed to swallow it all. Within minutes, her breathing began to deepen. The fevered flush in her cheeks started to fade, and her eyes fluttered open with more clarity than they'd shown in days. "Papa," she whispered, and her voice was stronger already. Malachi held her close, feeling tears he'd been holding back for 3 days finally break free. The medicine was working exactly as Clementine had promised. Outside, he heard Marshal Hendricks speaking with cold authority. "Agent Morrison, you and your men are trespassing on territorial land under false pretenses. I suggest you return to Denver and tell Dr. Hamilton that his crimes are being investigated by federal authorities." "This isn't over, Marshal," Morrison snarled. "Yes, it is," Hendricks replied. "And if Dr. Hamilton sends more men after this woman, he'll answer to me personally." The sound of horses departing filled the night air. A few minutes later, Clementine emerged from the barn, her medical bag in hand, and hope cautiously lighting her eyes. "How is she?" Clementine asked, kneeling beside Ruby's bed. "Better," Malachi said simply. "Much better." Clementine checked Ruby's pulse and breathing, her professional demeanor giving way to relief. "The fever's breaking. She'll be completely well in 2 days." Marshal Hendricks appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Brooks, you're free to practice medicine in this territory, but I'd recommend staying away from Denver for a while. Dr. Hamilton has influence there, but not here." 3 months later, Malachi Brooks watched his wife tend to a rancher's broken arm, while Ruby played nearby, healthy and laughing. Clementine had established a small practice serving the scattered families of their territory, earning respect through skill and compassion. The 3 goats still grazed in their corral, but they'd become symbols of something far more valuable than the trade that brought them together. They represented the choice to trust, when trust seemed impossible, and the discovery that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as desperate bargains. Malachi had married a stranger for 3 goats to save his daughter's life. But what Clementine did in that barn the night of their wedding had given them all something more precious than medicine. She'd given them a future built on truth, love, and the courage to start over when the world seemed determined to destroy them. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.